Dark tales for dark nights.
Good evening, listener. Thanks for joining us. You're listening to Horror Story Time. Please welcome your host and the star of this series, master storyteller, Otis Jiry.
Krampus is Coming by Ward Hocutt. Narrated by Otis Jiry. I was only a child when I saw Krampus. My family had just immigrated to this country. We had left our every earthly possession behind, but the memories and stories of our homeland followed us on our journey. Once we arrived, we immediately settled into the same ghetto that so many others from our Eastern European village had. A decrepit row of 4-storied slums along an alleyway that was more sewer than street. Our father, during the few hours that he was home from the mill, said that we were better off here, but my sister and I missed the deep forests and high mountains that we played in only a short time ago. Even when I tried to imagine myself back at home, my real home, the noise of the city always broke through my thoughts and brought me back to the alleyway. My mother tried her best to remind us of our old life. Often, as my sister and I were crawling into the bed that we shared, she would tell us the stories. The same stories she said that her mother had told her. Some of the stories were exciting, others made us laugh, but a few terrified us. The most awful story told of an evil one who waited until the deepest part of winter to kidnap naughty children. We shuddered as she told us of how it would torment children just like us, and sometimes we would even pretend to fall asleep in the desperate hope that she would stop. But she always finished the story. Our father would often tell her not to fill our heads with such terrible and horrible things, that some tales from our homeland should remain there. Mother, though, would shake her head and quietly insist that it was dangerous to forget where we came from. Our lives continued like this for the next several months. I had believed that I would eventually come to see our forgotten alleyway as home, but its sense of foreignness persisted. In fact, it felt as though hardly anything had changed since we arrived. Our lives had neither improved nor gotten worse, and I still felt like an unwanted stranger in my own neighborhood. The only thing that had changed was our behavior. My sister and I had recently begun getting into trouble more often. We never meant to hurt anyone. It was just that we had so little, and sometimes we had to steal if we wanted to eat that day. Usually, our misdeeds were my sister's ideas, and I followed along. I guess one always looks up to their older sibling. I never believed that our petty crimes would ever have serious consequences, but looking back now, I can see that we were walking blindly down a dark path. I can even remember when things took an ominous turn. Ever since All Saints' Day, our mother had been warning us to be good little girls. She pleaded with us to stop our bad behavior. I remember her crying a lot. Early in December, my sister got caught stealing a piece of fruit, and I thought my mother's heart would break. She began to shake and pull her rosary beads from her pocket. For the rest of the night, she clutched the beads tightly and desperately repeated her prayers. When I finally asked her what was wrong, she paused just long enough to glance at the window and hissed, "He knows. He knows. It might be too late." I don't know what she meant, but I was scared. My sister didn't seem to care. The days passed and the temperature dropped. It was the night before Christmas, and snow had begun to fall. The heating had already gone out several times, and the flickering lights threatened to go out as well. As we would be attending the sunrise mass the next morning, my father told my sister and I to go bathe. Suddenly, my mother began shrieking for us not to be alone. I heard my father quickly move towards her and begin trying to comfort her with his deep, soft voice. She quieted down some, but still insisted that we not be alone. My father told us to take our baths quickly, then join them. As we headed down the hallway towards the washroom, my sister sprinted ahead of me and stood in the doorway. "I'll go first," she said. "I won't be long," she laughed. I stomped my foot but said nothing as the door closed. On the best of days, there was barely enough warm water for everyone in our family to bathe. With the heat going out, there was likely only enough warm water for one single bath. My sister knew this. I bounced from one foot to the other as she stood outside the door trying to keep warm. I heard her draw the water and then begin singing softly to herself as she dipped into the water. After a few minutes, the singing had stopped, and I began to fear that she had fallen asleep in the tub. Then I heard a noise, a sharp clacking noise, like someone was wearing wooden shoes. It was slow but deliberate, almost like it was sneaking up on something. I knocked on the door and the clacking stopped. No answer. I assumed my sister was just ignoring me and possibly trying to irritate me as she often did. Then the noise began again, this time even slower. I pressed my ear to the door and held my breath. The clicking noise had stopped, but I could now hear a light tinkling sound, like the chime of 100 bells playing at a distance. I listened until I could hear my own heartbeat. Then I heard a soft splash. She hadn't fallen asleep. She was playing a game, waiting to see how long I would stand out in the cold hallway while she turned her fingers and toes into warm prunes. I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. I was quite frustrated and cold by this time, and so, without another knock, I swung open the door and stepped inside. As I did, the power in our building went out. The hallway behind me plunged into total darkness, and I heard my mother give a cry of fright. I blinked my eyes a few times. The small heater in the corner of the washroom cast an eerie orange glow across the room. Feeling my way until my eyes adjusted, I stepped around the curtain at the end of the tub and began to scold my sister for taking too long. Then I saw it. It was standing beside the tub. Though it was hunched over, it must have stood nearly 7 feet tall, with its horns adding another foot or so. Coarse, black fur, like the pelt of a goat, covered its body. It had powerful legs that ended in hooves, the source of the clicking noise. A thick tail whipped through the air like a cobra circling its prey. Heavy chains wrapped around its muscular shoulders and torso. As it inhaled and exhaled, the chains produced their bell-like chimes. Yellowed eyes that burned with a smoldering rage stared down from above its twisted nose. A wheezing, bubbling sort of breath passed between its fangs and incisors that extended so far from its mottled gums that I don't believe it could have possibly closed its mouth completely. A long, pointed tongue hung down past its scarred and disfigured chin like some grotesque dog, and thick globules of spittle collected at the corner of its mouth. One of these globules broke free and fell into the tub. I looked down and saw its hands, long and hairless. Each finger ended in a sharp nail and was wrapped in the same kind of corpulent skin as the vulture's bald head, the result of too much exposure to rotting flesh. Then I noticed the thin wisps of hair floating up between its fingers. My sister's hair. The beast was holding her head under the water. I screamed. Only at this point did it look at me. It was not alarmed, but rather seemed almost whimsically bemused, as if I was asking it a riddle that it already knew the answer to. Looking directly at me, it stood up to its full height, its horns now brushing the ceiling. As I stood, it lifted my sister out of the water. My screams caught in my throat, and I began to choke. It held her with a single hand, each of its 5 sharp nails having pierced completely through her body. Strangely, the only coherent thought that passed through my mind at that moment was the hope that my sister had already drowned and could not feel the pain. The beast took a step towards me and gave a dry, shrill laugh that sounded like an animal being strangled. It held my sister out as if it were cruelly offering her body to me. Then we both heard the footsteps in the hallway. My parents were running to see what was the matter. The beast quickly wrapped its heavy chains around my sister's lifeless body and cinched her to its back. Then, with surprising agility, it threw open the window and leapt onto a narrow ledge. It balanced there for a moment, then turned to look at me one last time. Our eyes met, and in that moment it burned the full horror of itself into my very soul. Then it leapt from the ledge and disappeared. My parents were already in the washroom before I realized that the beast was gone. They held me tight and began asking me what was the matter. I could not speak, but only pointed toward the tub, then the window. My mother was the first to notice my sister's clothes laying beside the tub, and instantly ran to the open window. I heard her scream curses in our old language at the darkness. Then she collapsed, and my father ran to her, begging for someone to tell him what was going on. My mother was near to fainting and could only point to the hoof-like print in the snow upon the ledge and speak a single word. Krampus. I don't remember much after that. 4 days later, my sister's body was found by a sewer grate. There was no investigation, no arrests made. To this society, she was just another dead immigrant child, no different in their eyes than a drowned sewer rat. Not that it mattered much. No manhunt would ever turn up that creature which was not a man. I am old now. Over the years, I have seen all my friends from that hellish ghetto die, some of them in horrible accidents. Yet I have always found some measure of peace with every one of their deaths. I do realize that death is inevitable. But there is one fact that keeps me from finding peace with my sister's death. When the police officer came to visit my family, he said that my sister had only been dead an hour before they had found her body. Letters to Santa by Miamode, narrated by Otis Jiry. As a mail carrier, I see a lot of these letters. Usually addressed to a Mr. Claus in the North Pole. Sometimes there's a stamp, sometimes there's not. I always make sure to grab these letters. I like keeping the spirit alive. I throw them in my bag and I move on. Whenever I return to my car, I like to look through them, whatever special letters I've collected. It gives me an insight into what type of children live in these homes. The upscale neighborhoods ask for too much. The poorer neighborhoods ask for very little. Handwriting varies from neat bubbled letters with hearts dotting I's to messy scrawl, and spelling that either can be accredited to the little ones or children that don't do very well in school. On this run, a particular letter catches my eye, although it can hardly be called a letter. A piece of paper cut vaguely rectangular with jagged edges that could cut the skin. No stamp, just a drawn square in the top corner that could substitute for one, I suppose. Shaky lines, imitating the folds of a letter on the back. And a message addressed to none other than the fabled Mr. Claus of the North Pole. It catches my eye because it's very simple. Messy handwriting, terrible spelling. The message, however, is very clear. The last line is all I can see. I've been very good this year. Please help me. These are the letters I look for. I tuck this incredibly special letter away in my pocket. The child's address is on the back. I run over my mental list. Neglectful parents? Check. Bad family life? Check. Bad neighborhood? Check. I peek up at the apartment door from where I'm parked. Easy getaway. Check. I get on with my route, and before I know it, I'm back at the apartment complex at the dead of night. I've always prided myself on my efficiency and timeliness. It's 3 in the morning, and surprisingly, there's not a single soul in sight. I park close to the complex, but as far from a streetlight as I can manage. I pull the letter out from where it's been burning a hole in my pocket all day. It might be dark, but the address is very clear to me. It's relatively easy to break into the apartment. The parents didn't even lock the door. A cursory glance around the room reveals empty bottles of alcohol and stains on a carpet that, at one point, must have been beige. Oh, this one won't be missed. I reach my target and they're asleep. I work fast, nonetheless. Tape over the mouth, a bag over the head, handcuffs. They only begin to stir when I'm down the street and they're in the back seat of my car. The place that I live is fairly secluded, and there's a very wonderful soundproof bomb shelter in the backyard. I thank whatever paranoid nut that lived here before me every time I bring a victim home. I sit them on the chair. They're struggling. I've worked with victims that like to squirm before, so it's not long before I've bound them to the chair. I pull off the cloth bag I've put over their head, and their eyes blink open. The shelter is bright. My instruments almost glitter in their mounts on the walls. I smile down at my victim. The fear in their eyes only reinforces how much I love my job. You've been very naughty this year, Mr. Meyer. I hope this precious little girl doesn't mind Christmas coming early this year. Strange Christmas Game by J.H. Riddell. Narrated by Otis Jiry. It was the middle of November when we arrived at Martingale, and found the place anything but romantic or pleasant. The walks were wet and sodden, the trees were leafless. There was no flowers, save a few late pink roses blooming in the garden. It had been a wet season, and the place looked miserable. Claire would not ask Alice down to keep her company in the winter months, as she had intended, and for myself, the Cronsons were still absent in New Norfolk, where they meant to spend Christmas with old Mrs. Cronson, now recovered. Altogether, Martingale seemed dreary enough, and the ghost stories we had laughed at while sunshine flooded the room became less unreal when we had nothing but blazing fires and a wax candle to dispel the gloom. They became more real also when servant after servant left us to seek situations elsewhere, when noises grew frequent in the house, when we ourselves, Claire and I, with our own ears, heard the tramp-tramp, the banging, and the chattering which had been described to us. My dear friend, you doubtless are free from superstitious fancies. You pooh-pooh the existence of ghosts, and only wish you could find a haunted house in which to spend a night. Which is all very brave and praiseworthy, but wait till you're left in a dreary, desolate old country mansion, filled with the most unaccountable sounds, without a servant, and none save an old caretaker and his wife, who, living at the extremest end of the building, heard nothing of the tramp-tramp, bang-bang, going on at all hours of the night. At first, I imagine the noises were produced by some evil-disposed persons who wished, for purposes of their own, to keep the house uninhabited. But by degrees, Claire and I came to the conclusion the visitation must be supernatural, and Martingale, by consequence, untenable. Still, being practical people, unlike our predecessors, not having money to live where and how we liked, we decided to watch and see whether we could trace any human influence in the matter. If not, it was agreed we were to pull down the right wing of the house and the principal staircase. For nights and nights we sat up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, Claire engaged in needlework, I reading, with a revolver lying on the table beside me. But nothing, neither sound nor appearance, rewarded our vigil. This confirmed my first ideas that the sounds were not supernatural, but just to test the matter. I determined on Christmas Eve, the anniversary of Mr. Jeremy Lester's disappearance, to keep watch myself in the red bed chamber. Even to Claire I never mentioned my intention. About 10, tired out with previous vigils, we each retired to rest, somewhat ostentatiously perhaps. I noisily shut the door of my room, and when I opened it half an hour afterwards, no mouse could have pursued its way along the corridor with greater silence and caution than myself. Quite in the dark, I sat in the red room. For over an hour I might as well have been in my grave for anything I could see in the apartment, but at the end of that time the moon rose and cast strange lights across the floor and upon the wall of the haunted chamber. Hitherto I kept my watch opposite the window. Now I changed my place to a corner near the door, where I was shaded from observation by the heavy hangings of the bed and an antique wardrobe. Still I sat on, but still no sound broke the silence. I was weary with many nights watching and tired of my solitary vigil. I dropped at last into a slumber from which I awakened by hearing the door softly opened. "John," said my sister, almost in a whisper. "John, are you here?" "Yes, Claire," I answered, "but what are you doing up at this hour?" "Come downstairs," she replied. "They're in the oak parlor." I did not need any explanation as to whom she meant, but crept downstairs after her, warned by an uplifted hand of the necessity for silence and caution. By the open door of the oak parlor, she paused, and we both looked in. There was a room we left in darkness overnight, with a bright wood fire blazing on the hearth, candles on the chimney-piece, the small table pulled out from its accustomed corner, and 2 men seated beside it playing at cribbage. We could see the face of the younger player. It was that of a man about 25, of a man who had lived hard and wickedly, who had wasted his substance and his health, who had been, while in the flesh, Jeremy Lester. It would be difficult for me to say how I knew this, how in a moment I identified the features of the player with those of the man who had been missing for 41 years. 41 years that very night. He was dressed in a costume of a bygone period, his hair was powdered, and round his wrists there were ruffles of lace. He looked like one who, having come from some great party, had sat down after his return home to play cards with an intimate friend. On his little finger there sparkled a ring. In the front of his shirt there gleamed a valuable diamond. There were diamond buckles in his shoes, and according to the fashion of his time, he wore knee breeches and silk stockings, which showed off advantageously the shape of a remarkably good leg and ankle. He sat opposite the door, but never once lifted his eyes to it. His attention seemed concentrated on the cards. For a time there was utter silence in the room, broken only by the momentous counting of the game. In the doorway we stood, holding our breath, terrified yet fascinated by the scene which was being acted before us. The ashes dropped on the hearth softly, and like the snow, we could hear the rustle of the cards as they were dealt out and fell upon the table. We listened to the count. 15-2, 15-4, and so forth. But there was no other word spoken till at length the player, whose face we could not see, exclaimed, "I win! This game is mine." Then his opponent took up his cards, sorted them over negligently in his hand, put them close together, and flung the whole pack in the guest's face, exclaiming, "Cheat! Liar! Take that!" There was a bustle and confusion, a flinging over of chairs, and fierce gesticulation, and such a noise of passionate voices mingling that we could not hear a sentence which was uttered. All at once, however, Jeremy Lester strode out of the room in so great a hurry that he almost touched us where we stood. Out of the room, and tramp up the staircase to the red room. Hence he descended in a few minutes with a couple of rapiers under his arm. When he re-entered the room, he gave, as it seemed to us, the other man his choice of the weapons, and then he flung open the window, and after ceremoniously giving place for his opponent to pass out first, he walked forth into the night air, Claire and I following. We went through the garden and down a narrow winding walk to a smooth piece of turf, sheltered from the north by a plantation of young fir trees. It was a bright moonlight night by this time, and we could distinctly see Jeremy Lester measuring off the ground. "When you say 3, he said, at last, to the man whose back was still towards us. They had drawn lots for the ground, and the lot had fallen against Mr. Lester. He stood thus, with the moonbeams falling upon us, and a handsomer fellow I would never desire to behold. 1, began the other. 2, and before our kinsman had the slightest suspicion of his design, he was upon him, and his rapier through Jeremy Lester's breast. At the sight of that cowardly treachery, Claire screamed aloud. In a moment the combatants had disappeared. The moon was obscured behind a cloud, and we were standing in the shadow of the fir plantation, shivering with cold and terror. But we knew at last what had become of the late owner of Martingale, that he had fallen not in fair fight, but foully murdered by a false friend. When late on Christmas morning I awoke, it was to see a white world, to behold the ground and trees and shrubs all laden and covered with snow. There was snow everywhere, such snow as no person could remember having fallen for 41 years. It was on just such a Christmas as this that Mr. Jeremy disappeared, remarked the old sexton to my sister, who had insisted on dragging me through the snow to church, whereupon Claire fainted away and was carried into the vestry, where I made a full confession to the vicar of all we had beheld the previous night. At first, that worthy individual rather inclined to treat the matter lightly, but when, a fortnight after, the snow melted away and the fir plantation came to be examined, he confessed there might be more things in heaven and earth than his limited philosophy had dreamed of. In a little dear space just within the plantation, Jeremy Lester's body was found. We knew it by the ring and the diamond buckles and the sparkling breastpin, and Mr. Cronson, who, in his capacity as magistrate, came over to inspect these relics, was visibly disturbed at my narrative. "Pray, Mr. Lester, did you in your dream see the face of the gentleman, your kinsman's opponent?" "No," I answered. He sat and stood with his back to us all the time. "There is nothing more, of course, to be done in the matter," observed Mr. Cronson. "Nothing," I replied, and there the affair would doubtless have terminated, but that a few days afterward, when we were dining at Cronson Park, Claire all of a sudden dropped a glass of water she was carrying to her lips, and exclaiming, "Look, John, there he is!" rose from her seat, and with a face as white as the tablecloth, pointed to a portrait hanging on the wall. "I saw him for an instant when he turned his head toward the door as Jeremy Lester left it," she explained. "That is he." Of what followed, after his identification, I have only the vaguest recollection. Servants rushed hither and thither. Mrs. Cronson dropped off her chair into hysterics. The young ladies gathered round their mamma. Mr. Cronson, trembling like one in an ague fit, attempted some kind of an explanation, but Claire kept praying to be taken away, only to be taken away. I took her away not merely from Cronson Park, but from Martingale. Before we left the latter place, however, I had an interview with Mr. Cronson, who said the portrait Claire had identified was that of his wife's father, the last person who saw Jeremy Lester alive. "He's an old man now," finished Mr. Cronson, "a man of over 80, who had confessed everything to me. You won't bring further sorrow and disgrace upon us by making this matter public." I promised I would keep silence, but the story gradually oozed out, and the Cronsons left the country. My sister never returned to Martingale. She married and is living in London. Though I assure her there are no strange noises in my house, she will not visit Bedfordshire, where the little girl she wanted me so long ago to think of seriously is now my wife and the mother of my children. The War on Christmas by Jen Collins, Narrated by Otis Jiry. Todd sat up in his bed. His digital clock read 4:03. Too early, he thought. His mother told him no matter how excited he was, he had to stay in bed until at least 5. With a sigh, he flopped back onto the twin mattresses and pulled the warm down comforter back over his face. But he knew that sleep wouldn't come. He was just way too excited. After all, it was Christmas Eve. Ever since the first snow began to fall, the excitement for the upcoming holiday became nearly palpable. The days seemed to drag on, each one longer than the next, as he counted down to the holiday. And now the day was here. It was almost time. He rolled over again to steal a glance at the clock. 4:05. He had to find a way to make time pass. He started counting, not counting anything in particular, but just running his mind up the numbers. It was a concentration tool that he had learned, and he found that it helped him pass the time during class when he was bored. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He sat up with a gasp. Had he fallen asleep? The cold morning light illuminated his room. With one motion, he jumped out of bed and looked at his clock. 7:43? How did this happen? He shoved his feet into his dog-faced slippers and bolted down the stairs. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Todd's mom smiled. "I thought you were going to miss the big day." The smell of cinnamon French toast permeated the kitchen. "Your breakfast is almost ready. After you eat, let's get you showered and dressed, and we'll go to the mall to see Santa. Are you ready to see Santa today?" Todd grinned, showing his missing tooth. He just experienced the loss of his first baby tooth a few weeks ago, and was pleased to have received $1 from the tooth fairy for it. Not that he believed in something as silly as the tooth fairy. "Of course I'm ready. I've been waiting for this for forever." "Good," she replied, but she already knew that was his answer. They had been talking about this day for a long time. She piled his plate high with French toast, and while he was nearly too excited to eat, his mom's French toast was nothing to pass up. He ate every bite, dropped his fork, and darted upstairs to shower. As he dried himself off, he carefully examined the outfit that his mom had picked out for him for the occasion. A thick red sweater with reindeer appliques, brown cords, warm socks, and a pair of boots. He nodded in approval at her choices and dressed himself quickly. Within minutes, he was downstairs, and his mom helped him finish getting ready. 30 minutes later, they were in the car on the way to the mall. It was almost time to see Santa. As the moment drew closer, his mood grew solemn. Todd's mom sensed it immediately. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked. "Yes," he replied soberly. She pulled their red Corolla up to the front of the entrance of the mall and looked her son over. She opened his coat one last time to double-check the explosives he wore strapped beneath his sweater. They were ready. This was it. "I'll see you again someday, right, Mama?" Todd asked, tears welling up in his eyes. "Of course you will," she said sincerely. "Of course you will. Now, go tell Santa what you want for Christmas." Rocking Horse Creek by C.K. Walker. Narrated by Otis Jiry. My brother Teddy died December 11th, 1999, during our annual family Christmas party. He was 12 and I was 9. I wish I could say it wasn't my fault, but at the end of the day, the whole thing had been my idea. I'm from Woodbury, Minnesota, as is my entire extended family. Every Christmas, my parents would host a holiday party to eat, drink, and gossip. It was always a boring event, but I loved seeing all my cousins. The adults usually stuck us kids in the basement or the loft, but that year, my brother convinced them to let us go sledding at the park instead. We bundled up in our purple Vikings parkas and loaded up the sleds with blankets and our pockets with hand-warmer packets. Then me, my brother, and our cousins, Mike and Jeff, set off at the sledding hill, which was about a half-mile down the road. As soon as we were out of view of the house, Teddy stopped. "You guys want to do something fun?" he asked. "Hell yeah, of course." I want to go sledding, I muttered. Yeah, well, sledding is for babies, said Jeff. That's what I was thinking, too, his brother added. Teddy smiled. Good, because I want to take you guys somewhere way more awesome. Where are we going? I asked nervously. Mom and Dad will get mad if they look for us in the park and we're not there. They won't look. They're too drunk, Teddy laughed. But I think we should go to Rocking Horse Creek, he added coolly. Rocking Horse Creek was actually more of a small river than creek, but it had been called that for as long as I can remember. The creek had been named by neighborhood kids who found an almost life-sized rocking horse sitting abandoned and half submerged in the water. No one knew where it had come from, as no one knew the actual name of the river, because no one had ever been stupid enough to tell their parents that they went there. But Rocking Horse Creek is almost a half-hour walk from here, I whined. I was already cold and didn't feel like walking that far. Mike snorted. Don't be a baby. There are extra blankets, if you're cold, plus hand-warmer packets in your pockets. Yeah, Jeff added, and if you want, we can pull you along on the sled just like the baby you are. Mike and Jeff laughed, but Teddy didn't, and he punched Jeff in the arm. Stop it, you guys. I'm not a baby. And why go to the creek anyway? It's probably ice. Because it'll look hella cool, Teddy said. Yeah, I want to go, said Mike. We could tie our jacket strings to some sticks and go ice fishing. Yeah. Well, I'm really good at ice fishing, I lied, so I have to go so I can help you. Sure you are, Jeff rolled his eyes. The walk didn't take an hour. It was more like 35 minutes, though it did feel longer due to the cold. When we approached, we saw that the river was indeed frozen over. The ice looked several feet thick, though it was hard to tell. Mike and Jeff were really excited about it and kept testing their weight on the thinner ice of the riverbank. I sat down on my sled and drew a couple of blankets around me. I'm smaller than them, so I'm colder, I justified to myself. Ted, Mike, and Jeff stood on the riverbank and threw rocks onto the ice to see if they could break it. When they failed to produce even the smallest crack, Jeff announced it was time to play Ricochet Dare. I hated Ricochet Dare. As soon as Jeff suggested it, I felt a cold stone drop in the pit of my stomach. Ricochet Dare was something we'd been playing since we were little kids. The rule stated that if you dared to do something and you didn't do it, the game would end and you would be the new wuss. And this ridicule would go on for weeks or even months. However, if you did go do it, and then you got to dare someone in return. Generally, the dares start off mild, but with every round the stakes get higher. The game would only end when someone inevitably wussed out, and of course that person was usually me. But not this time, I thought, as I shrugged off my blankets and stood up, pushing my hat up from my eyes. I had to redeem myself and make Teddy proud. I had to show them I wasn't a baby. Come on, Jeff yelled at me. You go first. Okay, what's the dare? I asked with false bravado. Jeff said. Okay, you have to take 3 steps out onto the ice. I eyed the frozen river warily. 3 steps? Yep, and not baby steps, real steps. Stop it, I'm not a baby. Then prove it. I took my first step lightly and paid close attention to the give of the slippery mass beneath me. There was none that I could feel, and the ice made no sound of protest underneath my feet. I took the 2 last steps quickly, then turned around and half-skated back to shore. My brother gave me a huge smile and a high-five. I dared Mike to take 4.5 steps. Mike dared Ted to do 6 steps. Ted dared Jeff to do 10 steps. And then Jeff dared me to walk all the way to the opposite shore. The ice hadn't made a sound since we started the game, instead remaining as silent as death. Still, there was something unsettling stringing through the cold air and in the silence. I stalled for as long as I could, trying to decide if I should complain. Jeff's dare was actually 2 dares, and I didn't think that was fair. Technically, I would have to do it twice, once to get to the opposite shore and once to get back. I was afraid of falling through to the cold water I knew was raging by under the ice. "Come on, don't be a baby, just do it," Mike said. "Little baby, afraid of the icy-wicey," Jeff mocked. "Stop it, you guys, I'm not a baby. This dare isn't fair. It's 2 dares. My voice was drowned out by Jeff and Mike's mock baby cries. I looked at Teddy for help, but he was laughing. Laughing. My older brother didn't even attempt to stick up for me. He was joining in with them. I felt my lower lip wobble and tears filled my eyes. "Don't cry. Babies cry. You're not a baby." I jerked my head back to the river so they couldn't see my red face and treacherous tears. I felt a sob begin to bubble up through my throat, and I knew I couldn't let them hear it. I would die before I let them see me cry. I took a deep breath and ran across the ice as fast as I could, and for a moment I actually hoped I did fall through. They would be in so much trouble, and they would feel so sorry that they'd made fun of me and called me a baby. With every slap of my foot, I listened for the telltale sound of cracking ice. But none came, and before I knew it, I was on the other side. I raised my fists in the air triumphantly and waited for the cheers. When I turned to look back, they were still standing in a circle together, laughing. They hadn't even been watching me. They missed the entire dare. And I wanted to cry all over again. I swallowed the tears and was about to yell that I wanted to go home. But just then I noticed something dangling from the tree above them. How had I forgotten? I was the only one who had noticed it, and I realized it was my ticket to revenge and redemption. But who to dare? I stood silently watching them as they joked with each other and pointed at each of them in turn, silently mouthing to myself, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a tiger by the toe. If he hollers, let him go. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo." My finger landed on Teddy. Good, I thought. He was supposed to be my brother. He deserves it the most. I cleared my throat. "I dare!" I yelled across the small river, interrupting them. They turned to look at me, almost surprised to see me standing on the other shore. So they had forgotten about me. "I dare," I started with renewed anger, "Teddy, to rope swing across the creek and land on this side." There was silence as, in tandem, all 3 looked up at the rope hanging from the tree above them. During the summer we would take turns swinging on it and cannonballing into the water, and if you pushed off the tree hard enough, you could actually make it to the other side of the creek. I'd seen my brother do it many times. Teddy's eyes got wide, and he looked at me as if I'd sentenced him to death. Jeff and Mike immediately started prodding him, telling him not to be a wuss. I smiled smugly from the other side of the river. I hoped he'd failed the dare. It'd be just what he deserved. It didn't take much name-calling for Teddy to climb the tree and grab onto the rope. He tested it a few times, then hung on it with all his weight. It held like it always had. "When I get over there, I'm going to dare you to do jumping jacks in the middle of the creek," he yelled at me. That's when I realized my mistake. If Teddy dared me to do that, I would most certainly wuss out, and then they'd tease me until Easter. I sent up a prayer, silent prayer, up to God, that Teddy didn't make it to the other side of the river. "On 3, Mike yelled to Teddy. I watched Teddy count silently to himself, then push off from the tree as hard as he could. He swung in a long, deep arc just like he always did. I watched the scene with my fingers crossed, hoping the rope wouldn't go far enough and they would have to land back on the riverbank. His dare unfulfilled and the game ended. But I could tell immediately that he was going to make it and somberly stepped backward to make room for him to land. And then suddenly, the loudest sound I've ever heard before or since rang through the air like a gunshot. Teddy broke through as soon as he hit the ice, and the rope and tree branch followed him down into the darkness below. I felt my feet moving under me as I slipped and slid my way out to where he had gone in, sheer panic crushing my chest like a vice. All 3 of us were on our bellies, groping for the angry, jagged hole within 10 seconds. We searched the watery void, but all we could feel was the tree branch below us. Within a minute, we couldn't feel anything at all. Our hands and arms had gone numb. Jeff pulled Mike and I to our feet and started running for the sleds. "Leave his sled here. We need to get out of here now." I felt cold and dead. I stumbled blindly toward the sound of my cousin's voice. "We need to save Teddy. I want Teddy. He's in the ice. You have to get Mom and Dad." But I was blubbering so badly by the end that I doubt they understood a word of it. And despite my slurred protests, I followed them into the woods, confused and cold. But after a while, I couldn't feel the cold anymore. I couldn't feel any pain in my heart or my body. In fact, I couldn't feel anything at all. Mike didn't say a word for the entire walk back, but Jeff went on and on about the plan. We would just say that Teddy decided to go home before us, and that he had said he was going to take a shortcut through the woods, the other woods on the far side of the road. I just nodded for a while, even smiled at his plan. God, to this day I don't know why I smiled. We were almost home by the time I began to process what he was saying. "No, I have to tell Dad to save Teddy," I told him. I was surprised by how flat my voice sounded. Mike just kept walking forward in a daze, but Jeff whirled around on me. "It's too late to save him, but you can save yourself. It's your fault that this happened because it was your dare. They will take you to jail for murder and put you on death row. It's an open and shut case. You can't tell anyone, ever, anything." And I don't know why I believed him, but I did. The hardest part of the day wasn't watching my brother die or the long, cold walk home. The hardest part by far was pretending like nothing was wrong when we got there. "What do you mean you haven't seen Teddy? He should have been back by now. He started home an hour before us." I couldn't keep my poker face for very long, though, and I started to cry. My dad thought it was because I was so cold that my skin had begun to turn to white. Search and Rescue searched the wrong woods for the next 24 hours because they believed our story. The sledding hill had been crowded that day, but a couple of people were sure they'd seen us there. The day after that, they intended to search the other side of the forest, the side Teddy was actually on, but a blizzard rolled in overnight, and that search was called off. My parents were told that wherever Teddy was, he was almost certainly dead. Parents in the neighborhood stopped letting their children play in the woods, even in the summer. My own parents wouldn't let me leave the house for a year. I grew up angry and spiteful. I hated everyone, but no one more than myself. I applied to college just to get away from my parents, whose constant love and support felt vile and wrong to me. I wished they'd have had another kid so they could give their love to someone deserving and stop talking about Teddy all the time. I got into the U of M. My grades sucked and I drank a lot. My parents pressured me to excel since I was their last horse in the race. I never returned their calls or emails. I lived with the guilt. Just barely, but I lived with it. If nothing else, I could take a bit of pride in the fact that I was surviving. Drunkenly one night, I finally told a couple of my close friends about it. They agreed that it wasn't my fault that shit happens, and Teddy wouldn't want me to dwell on it. I made the dare, but he climbed the rope. That night was a turning point for me. After being validated by people who actually knew the truth, I cut back on the drinking and I picked up my grades for the last 2 semesters, and somehow it was enough to graduate. A year later, I got an invitation to an engagement party at my parents' house. Cousin Jeff was getting married to a girl he'd met in the Navy, and I was invited to celebrate their love with them. As much as I always hated going back home, I wanted to support Jeff. Somehow, just knowing that he was living a full life despite our shared burden made me feel hopeful, like I could too. The party was quieter and more reserved than the parties my parents threw when we were kids. They had become less fun since Teddy's death, more refined, more somber. Jeff was quieter than I remembered, too, but he was clearly happy with his new fiancée, who seemed like a very nice girl. And though a wide smile was spread across his face, his eyes betrayed a certain guardedness, especially when he looked at me. I got up the courage to talk to him only once. We shared an awkward hug, and I congratulated him on the engagement and asked him about his brother. Jeff told me that Mike was addicted to heroin and living in Arizona somewhere. I said that it seemed Mike had never really recovered. Jeff said he didn't know what I was talking about and walked away. I spent the rest of the party hugging relatives, making small talk, and pretending to drink. Sobriety is suspect in my family. After a while, I went outside to take in a cigarette and a moment of peace, and in the secrecy of the autumn air, I started to cry. This party, it should be boisterous and loud. My parents should be lively and laughing. Mike should be running around the party, daring people to take mystery shots. I should be cheerfully telling stories from college and talking about my plans for graduate school. And Teddy should be here instead of lying dead at the bottom of a riverbed. I flicked my cigarette under my car and wiped the wetness from my cheeks. I knew what I had to do and where I had to go. I had to see the river that had haunted me since I was 9. Had anyone been back to Rocking Horse Creek? Was Teddy's sled still there? Had they replaced the rope? Had the creek dried up? This was my worst fear. It had secrets I didn't want to live to see revealed. I lit another cigarette as I walked and began to list all the reasons that this was a bad idea. I spent the hike either begging myself to find the strength to turn around or begging for the courage to continue on. I arrived at Teddy's grave before I was ready. The creek was loud and the water was moving quickly. Recent rain in the area to blame, no doubt. The rocking horse itself was in bad shape. Only its head was visible above the water now, and it was so rotted you could barely tell what it was anymore. No one had replaced the rope. I sat down next to the creek and took it all in. It was hard to believe this was the same place from which I still woke up screaming. It seemed to have healed since taking Teddy's life. If it could heal, maybe I could heal too. The tree was so full you wouldn't think it ever lost a single branch. The creek innocently bubbled by, full of life and vigor. Everything here was so different than I remembered, even the rocking horse. Where the toy had once been cheerful, almost animated, it was now just a morbid, misshapen head. Its eyes were pointed directly at me, and they bore a soulless stare right through me. It sent an involuntary shudder through my body, and I turned away from the horse's head in revulsion. I immediately saw what the horse had been looking at, a sliver of red plastic jutting out from the ground behind me. Teddy's sled. My reaction was visceral, and I had to lean over and vomit in the grass beside me. It was real. It had happened. Had I been pretending it wasn't real? Was that why I had really come here? To pretend that the past was gone and didn't matter anymore? How could I forget that what this place really was? I stumbled to my feet and began walking down the riverbank away from the buried sled, pausing every few feet to dry heave. I just wanted to get away from it, that thing that was all that remained of my brother. Everything that used to be Teddy laid at the bottom of the river now. I pulled a cigarette from my pack with a shaking hand. As I tried to light it, I tripped over something and fell forward, my cigarette rolling down the riverbank and into the water. It was a rope, and I knew right away that it was Teddy's rope. I kicked it away from me. It was worse than the sled. If I had anything left to throw up, I know I would have. The end of the rope lay deteriorating on the riverbank, with the length of it disappearing into the murky water of the river. And maybe I am morbid, or sick, or crazy, but I suddenly decided that I wanted to know. I wanted to see. I crawled over to it and picked it up. I felt just as it did all those summers ago when I used to swing from it into the water as Teddy clapped from the shoreline. I began to pull the rope out of the river. The water was fast-moving, and the rope was heavy. The creek didn't want to give up its secrets so easily, and it rebelled against my efforts. Still, I pulled harder. Just as I felt I was coming to the end of it, something long and thin breached the surface of the river. I saw it for only a moment before the rotted rope snapped and it sank back into the dark abyss. I almost dove in after it, but as I stood on the riverbank, my brain screaming at me, I realized what I'd almost done. What if that was Teddy? Would I want to see? Breaking from my trance, I hurled the rest of the rope into the river and fled into the woods. My lungs struggled to draw breath, and the trees began to spin around me. I anxiously lit another cigarette and let the shudders rack through my body as I waited for the nicotine to calm me. I stood there in the middle of the woods, the rope 20 feet behind me at the bottom of the river, and took short drags off my cigarette. And when my breathing had become bearable again, I felt someone watching me. It was Teddy, of course. He sat with his back against a tree, faded purple parka still bright in the mid-afternoon sun, and in some parts bleached almost as white as his bones. Ripped foil from an opened hand-warmer pocket was clutched in his hand, still remaining after all these years. He stared at me accusingly. The deep eye sockets of his skull were somehow not empty. Instead, they held a knowing consciousness that he knew what we had done. We knew we'd left him to die. But we hadn't known that, Teddy. We hadn't. We didn't know you crawled out of the river. We didn't know you were freezing to death as we ran home to bury our secrets. We would have saved you, Teddy, if we had known. You know that. We would have saved you. I yelled at this skeleton. In my head, or out loud, I'm not entirely sure. But Teddy just sits there staring at me. 30 yards from the rocking horse, 20 yards from the broken tree. And I know he'll sit here forever, because Jeff and Mike don't need to know that our sins are far more terrible than we'd ever thought. I know it's only my burden to bear, and I can tell, as he watches me in the fading sunlight, that Teddy agrees. The Tundra by David Fewling. Narrated by Otis Jiry. The native villagers around these parts say there's a stretch of tundra just north of here that is occupied by benevolent spirits. These spirits grant insight and warning to whoever visits them at night, once the sun has disappeared entirely and left the world in jet darkness. I drove out to the middle of the frozen expanse of ice and waited, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever commanded these people's reverence. They send their children out, bundled in furs, to keep from freezing on the eve of their 15th birthday to seek an audience with these spirits. Once they have achieved this, the children run home to their parents to share the news. From then on, these children are considered adults in the village. Engaged couples visit the tundra on the night before their wedding. The entire village stays up all night waiting their return, as it is upon their return that the couple either decides to proceed with the marriage or to abandon it. The elderly visit the tundra whenever they're sick or ailing, and often make their condition worse by staying all night in the cold. When they return, however, it is most often with an air of sheer serenity. So I waited, curious to see what phenomenon might inspire people so powerfully. I waited for hours, bundled in my parka and sitting on the hood of my pickup. I waited until I felt that I was going to freeze to death, even in my thick clothing. I heard the spirit before I saw it. A crunching of snow in the silence made me jump off my truck and spin around. A hunched, gray-skinned man stood a few meters away. Sad, yellowed eyes stared back at me, set inside a skull which sprouted only a few greasy hairs. He breathed heavily, with a rattle that shook his fragile rib cage, and one of his arms looks as if it had been messily broken then neglected, allowing it to knit back together imperfectly. Badly scarred flesh marred his splayed legs. The man stared at me for perhaps 10 seconds, breathing in the frigid air and exhaling a sickly dribble of steam before disappearing when I blinked my eyes. I spun around, looking for the man, but he was truly gone. Approaching where he had stood, I found a pair of bloody footprints in the snow. Frantic with fear, I got in my pickup and headed for the village as fast as the ice would allow. A few villagers were waiting for me when I arrived, knowing that I had gone out and curious as to what might happen. I hastily got out of my truck and, approaching the nearest villager, I demanded, "What is so benevolent about these spirits? What is so insightful? How do these spirits help you?" "What did you see?" he asked, the look on his face now mirroring the fear in mine. I saw a man horribly disfigured and desperately sick, I screamed into his face, and the rest of the villagers around us backed away a step. Why? What does that mean? I begged him. The spirits show only one thing, the man explained. They show their visitors a year in the future.
Wreck the Halls by Charles Swain. Narrated by Otis Jiry. A series of bizarre events swept the town of Brereton, North Dakota. The town was Leon Maxwell's ideal place to take a vacation. Not only did he have family in the area, but it was peaceful. This year, however, his vacation was much longer than usual. Leon was an accomplished writer. His wife, Claire, thought it was a great idea for him to do a story on his hometown. Leon could not leave until the novel was finished. The cold and harsh winter this year was just as bitter as the previous ones, with temperatures cold enough to chill someone to the very bone. It didn't help matters much that some of the winters could very well last into May. Leon loved the quietness of the town, but after a month, he missed interaction with people, and so he got a seasonal job at the sugar refinery. Leon, along with the rest of the town, would be troubled by the upcoming days. One evening, he arrived at his house and saw more snowmen in people's yards than the day before. He wouldn't have thought anything of this, except that there was now a snowman in his yard, and he surely didn't make it himself. Once inside the house, Leon questioned his wife about the snowman. She told him she didn't even know there was a snowman in their yard until he brought it up. Leon also found a gift on the table. It didn't belong to him or his wife, and nowhere on the gift did it hint who it was from. He was curious and picked it up, even tried to shake it to see if he could hear anything. For now, Leon left it on the table and invited some friends to his house that night to talk a few things over. They were sitting around a squared table playing a card game. During the game, Leon brought up the snowman that was made in his yard and the mysterious gift he received. All of Leon's friends admitted to a snowman appearing in their yards too, along with the gift in their homes. Chris, Leon's next-door neighbor, spoke up. I don't even have any children, and my wife hates the snow, so I know she wouldn't even try to make a snowman. He continued on. As for the gift, I opened it. Well, at least the wrapping paper. I have no idea what is inside. What are you talking about? Leon questioned. Chris told Leon and everyone else in the group that the gift was just a box that is locked and didn't come with a key. Chris mentioned he did everything he could to try to open it, even smashing it, but it's as tough as titanium. Leon thought it was odd to be given such a gift with no way to open it or know what's inside. Claire mentioned that she tried calling the police all day, but everyone has apparently reported the same incident, so it'll be a while before the police get to their home. After the game, Leon had all of his friends go home, and then he went to sleep. For the most part, the next day for Leon was normal, until he returned home and checked the mailbox. Inside was a sealed, unmarked envelope. He walked inside of his house to show his wife as he started to open the envelope in front of her. A key fell out. The key had no company name or numbers on it. There was also a note inside the envelope. This note mentioned a gift and said not to open it until Christmas. Both Claire and Leon looked at each other and then the gift they got yesterday. Could this be a twisted prank? Before either of them even thought to open the gift and unlock the box, they heard a loud and horrific yell. It sounded just like their next-door neighbor, Chris. Leon told Claire to stay home as he rushed over to Chris's house. He banged on the door and tapped on the window, but no one answered. Leon finally lost his patience and broke down the door. Fear instilled every fiber within his soul when he stepped his way into the kitchen. There was Chris, but his left arm was missing and his throat had been slashed. A pool of blood surrounded the victim. The face, left on his friend, was that of pure terror. Leon rushed out of the home, and when he returned to Claire, he called the police. When the police arrived, Leon was sent to the station for questioning. Claire was also at the station, but was questioned in a separate room. The officer asked mostly about her husband, starting with where he worked. She responded, "He's a writer. He doesn't live in Brereton anymore, or even North Dakota for that matter. Leon visits this town once a year because only about 800 people live here. No publicity and no fans." "Is he going to give us a hard time?" said the officer. "I can't definitively say yes or no. Leon is the kind of person that if you treat him right, he'll give you the shirt off his back to help you out. However, if he's treated like a suspect, you won't get him to answer a single question, even if you interrogate him for hours. And if he does, I can say with absolute certainty, it won't be the kind of answer you like." Meanwhile, a group of teenagers are having a party held at their friend's house. By now, nightfall has approached. The music was so loud that they didn't hear the constant knocking at the door. One teen finally sees the door open and quickly goes to the stereo to turn down the volume. When the teen walked over to see who it was, it appeared the person must have ran off. The power just then went out and the inside of the home was covered in complete darkness. A glimpse of moonlight peered over a rather odd figure. It seemed to be a man with black gloves and boots, a red suit, and a bag over his shoulder. His face was masked by the dark, but the teens were sure the man in red was not invited. It was becoming clear that someone was trying their best to look the part of Old St. Nick. The disguised man took out a straight-edge razor, flipped it open, and stabbed his victim right to the heart. Bone-chilling shrieks and cries ensued. Some of the teens fled for their lives, while others watched, petrified in fear. When the razor travels within the victim's chest, it slits open into 4 separate blades to enhance the torture. The teen lived long enough to see his own heart get pulled out of his body. Didn't seem like Santa was done with his massacre yet. The other teen was a girl, and she tried to flee. The jolly old man pulled out a second weapon. This one looked like a chain of razors. He swung the chain, and it wrapped around the teen's arm. She tried to pull away, even though it made the blade slowly dig deeper into her skin and rip the flesh off. By now, the rest of the teens scattered, and the girl was left to fend for herself. As painful as it was, she ripped herself free from the chain of razors and ran up the stairs in a frantic fury. She trips midway and falls on the unforgiving stairs, hearing her leg snap. Her cries by this point fell on deaf ears, desperately trying to crawl to safety. Slowly, the man in the suit walked up to the stairs. He walked the first step, then the second step, and he spoke in a harsh tone. "You better watch out. You better not cry. You better not pout. I'm telling you why." Now he was on the 5th step, moving up to the 6th. The teen's eyes dilated as unspeakable harm was about to be reaped upon her soul. She would try to climb faster, but her mind was disoriented, bound by the terror that consumed within. She heard him say, "I see you when you're sleeping. I know when you're awake. I know when you've been good or bad." She quickly turned around and let out a shrill screech just as a straight edge lodged itself into the palm of her hand. The blade not only went through her hand, it cut into the floor. As painful as it was, she pulled away, which made her hand nearly slice in half. The stairs, covered in the crimson of pain she felt, was never ending. She couldn't see the attacker because her eyes were so flooded in tears. She shook violently to get away from his grasp, but the man in the red suit hoisted her over his shoulders and threw her through the 2nd-story window of the home. Shards of glass pierced her skin, and the scarlet rivers melted the snow when she landed on the ground. She laid there, lifeless. The howling winds outside droned out their screams. Hours passed, and it was clear that Leon was feeling uneasy at the police station. The officer on the other side of the table said, "You can understand, I hope, when I say we find your story lacking credibility. When we arrived at your neighbor's house, there was no body. Either you're lying to us to cover something else up about your missing friend, or this killer has taken his time to leave absolutely no trace of evidence behind. There were no hair follicles, no fingerprints from the killer. We couldn't even find any blood that might have seeped under the floorboards. Would you like to start back at the beginning, starting with the truth this time?" Leon didn't appreciate possibly being accused of his own friend's murder. His skin was more pale than usual as he dealt with the reality of having lost a good friend. The same friend he would visit every year when he came to the town of Brereton. Leon ran his hands through his dark hair and responded to the officer. "You got me. I did it. I did that horrible deed. The second part of my plan was to set out some pastries when you got to the house so you would stop and eat them. That way, when you gave me chase, you'd get stuck in the doorway. It's just a shame you arrived so fast. Calling you down to set up my trap was all for nothing." Just as the officer was about to say something, the door opened behind him, and a man who addressed himself as Detective Peter Larson walked in. He mentioned he came from out of town to help investigate the people that have mysteriously gone missing. It turns out since this interrogation, other people have disappeared. The officer was still intent on getting a confession out of Leon. "Your eyes are all red. Have you been drinking?" Leon slowly looked up and responded, "Officer, your eyes look glazed. Have you been eating donuts?" It looked like the officer was reaching for his baton, but the detective stepped in and said he'd take over. The officer glared at Leon and then slowly walked out of the room. Larson would approach Leon and said, "Don't let that officer get to you. He's just trying to solve the case, just like everybody else. You're free to go if you wish." Leon got up and was about to leave when the detective added, "You know, being a writer, you could be crucial to this investigation. You might even know some details that we could have overlooked. I'll even let you in on some things the police haven't released to the public yet if you agree to help us on this. You're the only person that has actually seen a dead body as of right now, if what you said is true." Leon opened the door, tempted to step through it. "This isn't why I came here," Leon responded. The detective was a persistent one and retorted, "So, it's better to do nothing and let more people possibly go missing? If you walk out, can you deal with the lives that might have been spared by helping us?" Leon shrugged. He looked outside the doorway as if it would be so easy to just leave. His head hit the door in frustration, and then he let go of the door handle and walked back to the detective. "Fine, but the deal is my wife gets placed safely somewhere until this case is solved." With that, the detective agreed and shook Leon's hand. Knowing that Leon had already had a long night, the detective agrees, let him catch up on some much-needed rest, and decides to start the investigation tomorrow on Leon's day off. Elsewhere, in the town of Brereton on Shakespeare Road, a man and a woman are sitting at home by the warmth of a cozy fire. They have all the lights off and are drinking hot cocoa. They thought they heard a sound, but brushed it off as being the sound of the wind. Suddenly, soot poured down from the chimney and put the fire out. The home was as black as midnight. The couple attempted to find the lights, but couldn't even see the hands in front of them. They heard someone, or something, slide down the chimney and walk inside their home. The bag the stranger had hoisted over his shoulders glowed. The person that intruded the couple's home was none other than old Saint Nick. The man, dressed in red, pulled out some lights that were attached to barbed wire. He would let out a smile. The woman ran into the living room and up the stairs. Midway up the stairs, her body sliced in half as a horrendous scream was heard from her, and she fell. The other half of her body lay motionless. A row of razor blades was attached from one end of the stair rail to the other, and when the woman ran through it, she cut her own body in half. The man in the red suit quickly and violently grabbed a hold of the other victim and threw him across a glass table. The man was cut badly and hurt, but Santa was not content. He dragged the man up the stairs, wrapped his neck around with barbed wire lights, tied the other end to the stair railing, then tossed the man down over the stairs so that he would hang. In just a few moments, the bodies of the man and woman of the household were lifeless. In the morning, Leon got a phone call. He was slow to answer upon waking up. It was a police officer, and he mentioned that Detective Larson would be at his home at any moment. Just as the officer announced this to Leon, he hears Peter knocking on his door. After Leon let Peter inside the home, the detective brought up how there has been 2 more missing people reported. They didn't stay long at the house before they were hurried over to the scene of the crime. When Detective Larson and Leon arrived, the detective showed his badge to the officers, who let them through. Once inside the home, Larson explained that a couple named Barry and Annette Costello lived there. It was Barry's boss that called when he didn't arrive at work that morning. In the 12 years that Barry had worked there, he had never been late to work once. Larson showed Leon around the home and then showed Leon photos taken just a few days ago. In the background of those photos was a glass table in the kitchen area, but strangely, now it's gone. Just like before, no one was home, but Leon noticed weapons were left behind. We wouldn't let the public know about it, but if this is the work of the killer, he always leaves his weapon behind. He leaves them all to a pristine shine and cleans them so well we can't get a drop of DNA from the weapons. Why would he leave his weapon and nothing else? Questioned Peter. Leon wondered for a moment and then said, because he wants to get caught. He doesn't want to make it too easy for him to be found. He only wants someone worthy enough to catch him. I know there is a murder out there because I saw Chris's body. I bet when I arrived, the killer didn't expect someone to show up so quickly, so he left and then returned to the scene of the crime later. Leon walked into each room carefully. He saw the metal box that Chris told him about, the box everyone got as a gift. Leon saw that the box had been opened, the key still in the lock. Something Chris didn't mention before his murder was that the box had two lights, a red light and a green light. Both of them were in the front of the box, but only the red light was lit up. Leon went to inspect the weapons. One of them was razors that were wrapped around the stairwell. When turned to the side, it would be very difficult to spot them in dim lighting. These razors, they've been cut and reshaped to line up into each other. You can't find anything like this out at a normal everyday store. I would check to see if anyone in the area owned some kind of workshop. I think the killer would have had to set up this trap on the stairs previously, which means he either knew the victims or knew when there would be a way to set it up. One officer shook his head and responded, "That sounds a little far-fetched. How would he know the couple wouldn't discover the trap earlier on, before the day he showed up?" Leon paced himself, put his hand in his coat, and said, "He probably didn't. He took a gamble. If the couple were like me, I don't go upstairs until I'm ready to go to bed." Leon looked at the blade once more, his eyes looking puzzled. One of the officers took off his hat as if he was embarrassed to even mention what he was about to say. "We think whoever is responsible for the missing people is dressing up like Santa Claus. We got a call from various teenagers that they saw a man dressed in red and white with a bag over his shoulder. Unfortunately, the lights in the home went out and it was too dark to get a visible ID on him." Leon felt like he had almost all of the pieces of this case to put together the killer's motive. As he tried to run everything through his mind, he looked out the window to the home across the street. A few kids were playing in the snow and even had a snowball fight. One of the kids thought it would be fun to beat up the snowman and took out a baseball bat. He swung at the snowman's head and gave 2 or 3 good strikes. Suddenly, the head came off and it tumbled over onto the driveway. As it did, the snow revealed a human head where the snowman's head once was. Blood seeped through the body of the snowman, and all the kids screamed and ran away. The police, along with Leon, rushed over as fast as they could. Now it was all too clear what happened to the bodies, and Leon tried his best to explain what he thought the killer's intentions were. Leon brought up how he felt the keys and the gifts in the people's homes were a way to tempt the wicked. In other words, people that were bad would open the box and the light under it turned red. The people that were good left their gifts alone until Christmas, and the box remained with a green light. Once the red light is activated, it stays activated even if the box is locked back up. One officer shouted, "Why the heck would he hide the bodies in a snowman?" Leon shook his head, annoyed. It's the last place most people would think to look. Even during all of your searching, you never stop to think the bodies might be hidden inside of a snowman. It's the perfect hiding place. The bodies in the snowman are a reminder of those that have been naughty, at least in the criminal mind. He wants everybody to see who's been bad. Leon felt into his coat and took out a key and remembered something else he wanted to find out. At first, I thought maybe someone from the post office might have been delivering all of the keys. He's the only one during normal circumstances that could go into everyone's mailbox without looking suspicious. But I realized this year has been some strong snowstorms. The killer could probably kill someone even in broad daylight and go unnoticed. There's something about that note that came with the key in the envelope that troubles me. Does anyone have a typewriter I can use? I want to see if that note was made by either using a computer or was typewritten. The idea caught the officers off guard. Almost no one used a typewriter these days, so the thought that the killer might have used one to make the note instead of typing it out on the computer eluded them. Detective Larson mentioned he still keeps a typewriter that's being passed down from generation to generation in his family and would allow Leon to use it. Also, it just occurred to me that the 27th annual Christmas show is going to be coming up. It's done here every year. It might be a good idea to have extra security around when it happens, Leon concluded. In the following days, nothing happened, and Leon had time to study some of the other weapons the killer had possibly used, such as the straight edge and razor whip. He was sitting in an office with the detective. This man's truly crazed. Most weapons were tools at some point, but these were only designed with pain in mind. The whip appears to have piano wire running through the sides of the blades so that the whip appears to have piano wire running through the sides of the blades so that way it will recoil. I have an idea how he strengthened the metal so it would cut through the bone, but it's only a hunch. I thought of something similar and used it in one of my horror novels about giant spiders. He might have found a way to infuse metal with spider silk. The silk, used to make spider webs, is considered to be at least 10 times stronger than the armor in bulletproof vests. As the detective wrote down a few notes, an officer walked in and told him today is December the 7th, the day of the Christmas show. "Let's get going, then," Detective Larson shouted out. But Leon was still persistent in looking at the evidence and said he wanted to go home to check up on something. He told Detective Larson to go ahead without him, and he would meet him at the show later on. Leon went home to take a look at the typewriter that Detective Larson let him borrow. First, he tried to see if he could distinguish the difference between something typewritten and something printed out from a computer. He typed out a word on the typewriter, then took out the paper. Upon close inspection, he could tell there was a difference in using the typewriter, and it became clear that it was the preferable method of the killer when he matched it up to the lettering on the note. He took the typewriter to the police station for further investigation. After a few hours, he found some interesting discoveries and called in a few of the police officers. He asked where Detective Larson was, and one of the officers mentioned he was showing Claire the holding cells in the police station. The lights in the station would flicker a bit. At that point, Leon wanted to mention something. The lights completely turned off. The backup generators kicked in, and Leon tried telling the officer something, but the officer said in a rush, "The security cameras aren't working. I have to figure out what's going on. Whatever it is you wanted to tell me can wait till I get back." Leon, at a loss for words and frustrated, didn't have time to banter. He was now just focused on getting to the holding cells. He made his way into the room and saw Detective Larson and Claire inside one of the holding cells. The prison door shut behind and locked Detective Larson and Claire in, leaving Leon on the outside as he rushed over. He looked at Claire and then back at the detective, frantic. "I thought you went to the Christmas show." The detective lit up into a smile and said, "I did. After a while, the security said I wasn't needed there, so I came back. Claire said she got bored walking around the station all day, so I thought I'd show her where we detain the prisoners before sending them off to jail." Leon looked at his wife, then back to Detective Larson. Leon seemed awfully nervous. He whispered to the detective, "Look, I know what's going on now. It's all over. Let my wife go." Detective Larson looked at Leon, confused, and there was a look of concern on Claire's face. "Just stop pretending and give yourself up. I know you're the one that put those notes in everyone's mailboxes. You're the serial killer. You thought you would never get caught, didn't you? You probably forgot the typewriter ribbon stored everything you wrote. Every character you depressed on the keyboard was your admission of guilt. I don't need any other evidence. Just stop playing the innocent game and unlock the cell now." The detective's eyes dilated. He looked shaken up. His body looked like it was about to distort, but it held together. A grin that didn't look at all jolly showed on the killer. He put on some gloves and turned around to face Claire. Detective Larson started to sing. "I'm making a list and checking it twice. Going to find out who's naughty or nice." Claire backed away as far as she could from Detective Larson. demanding Leon to help her. Leon wanted to get reinforcements, but at the same time, he was too afraid to leave Claire with the detective. He was able to reach through the bars enough to grab the back of Larson's coat, but his grasp was soon pried away. Detective Larson looked under his boot and took out some tools. They were in separate pieces, and as he attached them, they made an axe. He pressed a button on the handle, and spikes protruded up over the sides and top of the axe so that he could saw into his victim as he was cutting. He inched his way to Claire. She was in a frenzy as Leon yelled, "Larson, don't!" The lights flickered again and went out. A loud scream was heard. The Christmas Tree by Michael Whitehouse, narrated by Otis Jiry. Staring at the tree, whiskey in hand, Pete was pleased that this year would be different from last. It had been the strangest time of his life, but he truly felt like things were finally coming together. And when better to come together than at Christmas, a time he loved more than any other. In some ways, the past year had been like an eternity, in others as if it had succumbed to time in the blink of an eye. But either way, he was glad to see the back of it. Staring at the Christmas tree, its beautiful lights casting a warm hue over the room, and the snow quietly falling outside as the sun set, Pete began to think of the past year, of his daughter, Lana, and his wife, Janet. It had started with a very normal December, 12 months earlier. The small town in which they lived was covered with a thick layer of snow, the residents spending most of their days clearing driveways, and Pete's wife going off for one of her usual wanders. She'd been gone for a couple of hours, but while Janet was utterly devoted to her family, she still needed moments to herself, to clear her head, to diminish the stress that comes with a loving yet disorganized husband, and a little girl who was kind, but whom enjoyed trying her parents' patience as much as possible. When the tensions of a domestic life clouded her feelings, or began to weigh on her spirits, Janet would wander out of the back door into the fields and woodlands which characterized the entire area, and trek for a little while through the pines which dotted the landscape. It therefore wasn't unusual for her to be gone for fairly long periods, especially since it was around that time of year when she would take it upon herself to choose the Christmas tree. No matter how much Pete or Lana asked to help out, this was Janet's job. She loved the tradition of it, the process of choosing the best tree possible, cutting it down, bringing it home on a small sled, and then seeing the bright smiles on her family's faces as they would gleefully take the tree indoors and decorate it with sparkling glitter garlands, warm glowing lights, and an array of festive baubles. It was a small highland town where they lived, far away from any major city, but Janet and the rest of her family loved their home, the simplicity of it, the feeling of being an integral part of a close-knit community, and, of course, the beautiful surroundings, lush during the Scottish summer and cold, crisp, stark, but yet awe-inspiring in the winter. Most importantly, she loved the pine woods nearby, specifically a collection of trees which sat at the top of a small hill within walking distance of the house. Perfect for picking a Christmas tree. She would return there each year, and while the numbers thinned due to a few other neighbors going there for the exact same purpose, there were enough trees to last a good many years. When she had been gone for 3 hours, Pete began to grow nervous, as this was longer than usual, and since it was getting dark, he took it upon himself to venture outside, telling Lana to lock the doors after him, and that he would not be gone long. Lana laughed when he told her that he expected that Mummy was struggling through the snow with a huge tree, bigger than any other they had ever had. Pete loved to see the excitement in his daughter's face at this time of year, and he told her to watch from her bedroom window to see what they would bring back. With this, she excitedly ran up the stairs straight to her window before he had to call her back down to lock the door. Gazing at the beautiful tree, he could remember that night like it was yesterday. The snow was crisp on the ground and crunched under his feet as it began to freeze. Small flakes fell from the sky occasionally, but Janet's footprints remained uncovered. Even without them, Pete knew where they were heading. The hill where Janet returned each year was only a 40-minute hike away. She would pick a pine tree from there. In fact, sometimes she picked two, one around 6 foot, the other a young tree about half the size, if they could find one suitable. It was difficult at times to find smaller trees, as they seemed to be rare in that area. Everyone in town seemed to like the idea of having a small tree in their children's bedrooms, so people would climb up there with an axe and take what they wanted, so there weren't as many on hand. Lana, at one time, had thought it was sad to cut down and kill the trees, just for people to look at, but Pete explained to her about tradition and that he was sure more would grow back. With time, she forgot this protest and looked forward to the years when she could have one. If a smaller tree couldn't be found, they had a lovely synthetic one which would sit at her window. Secretly, she loved this just as much, but as her father had said, tradition is tradition. The larger tree would be placed in the living room and adorned with an assortment of baubles, glittering decorations, and lights. The other, in Lana's room, would be sprayed with a can of fake snow and covered in hanging candy sticks and chocolates, although she was always told she could only have one a day before bed as a treat. Of course, occasionally she would break this rule and just hope no one would notice. Janet could always tell, but she would let it go. Christmas time was the best of times after all, and it was so brief. As Pete approached the hill, he knew something was wrong. He felt it in his bones. As he climbed, the snow began to fall in greater volume, and the sky dimmed with it. Standing at the humble summit, a stillness spread. Silence, interrupted momentarily by the almost audible patter of snowflakes floating gently to the ground. He followed the footprints now with purpose, knowing that if the snowfall increased, that it would be nearly impossible to find Janice. Twilight fell, covering everything in a dark blue wisp of color, as the frost began to nip at his now rosy cheeks. The footprints bobbed and weaved their way through the huge pines, finally stopping next to a wonderfully thick and vibrant tree, one which was perfectly suited for their purposes. The perfect size, almost 7 foot tall, a deep, life-filled green, and a thick abundance of branches and pines, which made it almost impossible to visually penetrate its cover in such a light. But yet, Janet was nowhere to be seen, and as far as Pete could tell, there were no other tracks in the snow leading away in any direction. She had most certainly been here, but where had she gone? This was both puzzling and worrying. It seemed impossible, but there they were, Janet's last 2 footprints engraved in the ground, but the snow all around, virgin, undisturbed, and lacking all signs of life. It was as if she had just vanished into the night. Looking at the base of the tree, Pete ran his fingers over a deep gash in its trunk. There was no doubt about it. Janet had taken a few swipes at it with her axe. Then, for some unknown reason, she had left, or perhaps moved on to a tree she felt was more suitable. Surely not, though. This tree was perfect. That must have been it, though. She must have moved on. Perhaps there was some random, freakish flurry of snow which covered her tracks. Yes, that must have been it. But Pete knew this was wishful thinking. He had lived there for years, and in all that time, he had never seen such a thing. Then he saw it. Several meters away, lying in the snow, was Janet's axe. He rushed over to the object, falling once as the snow deepened. Rising to his feet, it was now unmistakable. Yes, it was partially covered in snow, but it was still Janet's axe, all right. It lay there, much like the footprints, isolated, but with the absence of any human imprints. It was as if the tool had been dropped from a great height, but Pete did not care to speculate. A sense of growing worry permeated his mind as the thought of Janet lying somewhere injured increased his anxiety. Shouting his wife's name repeatedly drew no reply as darkness now began to creep ever closer. If she was hurt, he would have to raise the alarm and get the town out looking for her. along with mountain rescue. She wouldn't survive long in the snow in that biting cold. At this thought, the panic grew. Worry, fear, hurt that can only be felt through love. With torch in hand, he continued in the direction the axe had taken him. As he entered a thick den of pine trees, he noticed the broken branches littered on the ground, as if something had rushed past, tearing them apart and breaking them off on impact. Maybe Janet ran through here. The scale of the damage, however, looked too great to have been dealt by one person alone. Had he been in any other country, he would have assumed a bear was nearby, but they had been hunted to extinction in Scotland long ago, along with the wolves and any other predators. For a moment, his torch reflected off something scuttling under a bush, but it looked more like an insect than anything else, and again far too small to cause such devastation. Pete fixed his scarf, trying to cover his face as the frost bit deeper, but just as he did so, something caught his eye, something on the ground. Shining his torch on what he at first thought to be a dead animal was the crumpled body of Janet, lying still on the ground. A heart attack, they said. A heart attack? But Pete had seen her face. He had looked upon those eyes, once so filled with kindness, transfixed in a frozen stare. Cold, glassy, black with fear. Her hands were clenched in front of her, and the pathologist told him that this was perfectly normal for one suffering such a massive heart attack and such low temperatures. As was the contorted look on her face, although at the mention of this Pete saw a flicker in the pathologist's eyes, which gave away that he was as puzzled by that look as anyone. A look Pete would never forget. Darling Janet, love of his life, mother of his children, dying alone in the cold with lips pulled back over teeth in agony, frozen into an inhuman snare. The whole ordeal had devastated him. If it hadn't been for their daughter, Lana, for the necessity of her needs to be met before his own, Pete would have found it nearly impossible to have gotten through it. The past 12 months had been cluttered with reminders of an aching loss, as with any bereavement. The first time of doing something once shared without that person made the pain more acute. The first Christmas, the first day at work, the first walk to school, the first family get-together. Every person's face etched in concern, accompanied by the well-meaning but empty traditions of, "How are you holding up?" It must have been so difficult, and if there's anything I can do. Helping his daughter through the loss of her mother was all he had to make sure he could face another day. But that stopped now. They had been through the horror, through the denial, through the silent meals, through the lonely cries of despair at night, through the birthdays, empty and somber. They had been through it all. All these firsts were over. It had been over 12 months since Janet's death, and Pete felt almost exhilarated by this. He still missed her every day. The pain would never truly leave him, but the feeling of accomplishment, of strength, something which he thought had deserted him, that he had endured, filled him for the first time with thoughts of the future, thoughts of life that does indeed go on, even when our dearest have gone before us. And what of his beautiful daughter, dear, kind Lana? He may have felt compelled to bring her through the past year, but her empathy and strength had left him in awe, characteristics which someone so young had no right to possess, but which were thankfully present nonetheless. When she had cried, he had been there, and on more than one occasion, when he lay sobbing, staring at that empty void of space in his double bed at night, Lana would waken and climb in beside him, and they would both cry together until they fell asleep. She was his rock, and by God, she was going to have the best Christmas she'd ever had. Pete had made a number of arrangements. He had spent a fortune on every gift imaginable, He had filled the house with every food and treat that she enjoyed, and both Janet's parents and his own were flying in for Christmas dinner to be with their brave, sweet little granddaughter. He'd also organized for Lana's friends to have a sleepover on Boxing Day, which she had pleaded for, but Pete always knew he would give in eventually. She never asked for much, but this year, this Christmas, she would have more than she could imagine. The house was perfect, but there was one thing left to do. One thing that Pete had dreamt of since the night he found Janet's body. She had chosen that tree. It was going to be sitting in their living room, adorned with all manner of decorations. That was its purpose, its very reason for being. Janet never finished cutting the damn thing down. It was, in many ways, her dying act, and Pete was going to make sure that it was fulfilled. On the anniversary of her death, he wandered through the snow, winding his way through the pines, until he stood at the foot of that ominous little hill. The sun shone brightly, and it wasn't as cold as it had been the night Janet died, but each footstep was accompanied by a sickness in the pit of Pete's stomach. Each stride a morbid reminder of the previous year and that terrible heartbreak in the snow. Marching to its peak, he first walked to and observed the scene of Janet's untimely death. Standing there where her body had laid, Pete wiped the tears from his eyes and placed a small Santa figurine on the ground, burying it in the snow. It had always been hung from the branches of each yearly tree and was her favorite decoration. It seemed only right that it be with her. After another few minutes of trudging, there it was. It was still standing, that damn tree. As if ravenous for revenge, Pete pulled Janet's axe from his backpack and charged at the pine. He battered and chopped at the cut which Janet had made the previous year, making it deeper with every slice, with every pound of pressure he could muster. The tree groaned and creaked as if in pain, but Pete did not care. This tree was the final reminder of Janet's death. Whatever had happened that night, it happened because of that tree. As crazy as it seemed, it all made sense for the moment, and then clarity was clouded by mundane reality. She had simply died of natural causes. With the roar of cracked wood breaking under its own weight, the tree swooned and collapsed to the ground in defeat. Tying a rope around its trunk and then using string to fold its branches inward, Pete dragged that memory, that cold-hearted pillar of nature's brutality, through the snow, over grass and gravel, and finally to his back door. He was victorious. With little thought for carpet or furniture, he dragged it up to the stairs into the house and placed it in front of the window in the living room, wedging it upright into an old wooden stump they had used as a stand every year. Breathless and covered in sweat, he stood back, looking at the tree, standing tall over all it surveyed. "You picked a good one, love, you picked a good one." He held back the tears and waited for Lana to return home from her friends. Pete put up an old Christmas film on the television as they both decorated the tree together, singing, laughing, and being a family. There were moments, fleeting glances, when they caught one another's stare, a glance which showed pain buried deep down inside, one which said, "I miss her too." But it was Christmas, and the moments of grief passed, buffered by longer, carrying periods of happiness. Contentment caressed smiles from ear to ear, and festive spirit once more filled that home, which had for too long been host to loss and anguish. As night began to fall, after Lana went to bed, earlier than usual because the excitement had worn her out, Pete decided to reward himself for the day's efforts. The lights were dimmed, and after pouring himself a large whiskey, he sat on the living-room couch and stared at the tree. Draped in tinsel garlands and adorned with bright white Christmas lights, it really was a sight to behold, the best tree they had ever had. "Here's to you, gorgeous," Pete said, lifting his drink to the sky in a symbolic gesture. staring at the Christmas tree, its beautiful lights casting a warm hue over the room, and the snow quietly falling outside of the sunset, Pete began to think of the past year, of his daughter Lana and his wife Janet. Time passed slowly as he thought of all things gone, how they had led to this moment through pain and suffering, but now hopefully onwards to the future, and one filled with at least the briefest possibility of joy. The glow from the tree reflected off the window, but it penetrated far enough to illuminate the now thick blur of snow falling to the ground silently outside. The room remained dark, but the lights bathed everything subtly in a warm Yuletide radiance, which, when accompanied by the orange lambency of a fire, only served to cultivate the anticipation for Christmas even more so. For the first time in a year, Pete was happy. Something bothered him, though. There was a slight apprehension or annoyance at the back of his mind, something which was spoiling the display. Sipping at his whiskey, casting a glance at the entire room, he finally saw what the problem was. 2 of the Christmas tree lights were occasionally flickering. Not constantly, but enough to be noticeable and, more importantly, aggravating. Downing the rest of his drink, Pete rose to his feet, now feeling the aches in his muscles from the effort exerted while dragging that thing all the way home from the hill. Walking over to the tree, the lights were indeed flickering, but there was something unusual about them. They seemed deeper than the rest, as if coming from around the trunk rather than resting on the branches. Again, Pete was struck by how dark the interior of the tree was, that even in the presence of many lights placed upon it, he could not peer or adequately see between the branches. Even the 2 lights, which sat deeper behind the pines, did not seem to illuminate their surroundings in any way. The empty glass slipped from his fingers, smashing on the floor. The lights were fine. They were not flickering at all. But the occasional blinking of 2 eyes amongst the branches had been enough to catch his attention. He froze to the spot, and it was as if the room grew somehow darker. Something stirred between the pines, between the knotted wood and the scratched, porous surface. Something lived there. A feeling of utter paralysis now took hold, his feet firmly glued to the ground as the 2 eyes slowly pushed forward. Creaking and cracking, a face revealed itself from between the pine-covered branches, as if seeping out from its innermost visceral point. Mold-covered, ancient, its features twisted in rage. Fear began to course through Pete's veins. His heart beat faster and faster as the face moved closer. Its eyes, devoid of pupils, now swamped in a maddening yellow, and from below, the protrusion of 2 thin, moss-covered legs arching out from between the branches. With a creak and snap, it straightened itself, now standing in all of its terrible glory in front of the tree. It was now pitch black outside, and it would have been clear to Pete that this animal, this creature, was of a nocturnal nature, but in its stare he found himself helpless. His heart skipped. First it was a palpitation, then he could feel a searing pain in his left arm. He clutched his chest, but his feet remained adhered to the ground, and it was impossible to look away from those yellow, unmarked eyes. Its gaze came closer still, and in the pain which it brought, Pete knew he was going to die. To be found like Janet, cold, face contorted, and the second victim of that which lived amongst the pines on that hill. The pain was now unbearable, but the paralysis removed the possibility of a scream. What little light there was from the fireplace now illuminated its head, elongated on one side and pulsating on the other, its face dominated by a large dark hole which appeared in place of a mouth or nose, one which no light could penetrate. As its boil-ridden head stooped to meet his own, and the hole in its face almost touched his mouth, An involuntary sneer pulled Pete's lips up to reveal his teeth, as his face contorted into an entirely unnatural position. Then that one word, a word so powerful, so pure that even the most evil of intentions could be dispelled by it. "Daddy!" With the snap of wood, the gargoyle-like creature turned its wide yellow gaze to Lana. Standing at the bottom of the stairs, in her pajamas, her scream echoed out into the night. Arms outstretched, its odd-numbered fingers moved with a stutter as its moss-covered legs groaned, carrying it forward in a peculiar, unbalanced motion towards her. Now Lana was paralyzed by its stare, and with each step closer, her face contorted more fiercely, and the pain in her chest brought her to the point of unconsciousness. As intense as its ancient gaze was, it was focused. So focused that it did notice Pete clawing his way across the floor towards the kitchen. The wooden creature's unsure movements made it appear more like a puppet than a thing of autonomous purpose, and as it reached Lana, it cupped her face in its uneven hands and stared wide-eyed and pupilless into her face. Tears streamed down her cheek. The sound of feet running filled the air, and as it twisted to investigate, a loud crack was heard as Pete ran onto the couch, jumping high into the air, bringing Janet's axe down deep into its spine. No blood ran or gushed, but a plague of unfamiliar insect-like critters poured out of the wound. Instead of a howl of pain, the creature emitted a crescendo of strange squeals and clicks before throwing Pete to the ground and smashing through the back door. Lana's father gave chase, but it was impossible, as the wooden creature moved at an unimaginable pace, gliding on the ground with each stride, leaving no footprints in the snow. After a visit to the nearest hospital, both Lana and her father were given a clean bill of health, but they never returned to that house, filled with memories of the good times, the happy times, of a mother, a wife, a kind soul, of birthdays and weddings, and, of course, of Christmas time. Pete didn't know what that creature was, whether it was alive or dead, or something else entirely inconceivable to the human mind, but he made a solemn promise to himself from that moment on. Never again would he cut down a tree, decorate it, and take enjoyment in its appearance as it died, because no matter how pretty they are, no matter how much warmth they may give, no matter how much they may make people think of Christmas, you just don't know what may be living inside.
Under the Ice by Anonymous. Narrated by Otis Jiry. 6:52 a.m. Another nightmare. I wake up in a pool of my own sweat. My heart is pounding, and my brain feels like it's going to break through my skull. Through the window, the sun has just begun to rise, banishing the demons and the darkness of night back to hell where they belong. The light shines through the blinds and covers my room in a cage-like shadows. I sit up, pick up my watch up off the nightstand, and slide it on my wrist. I pull my rifle out from under the bed, knocking over a newly emptied whiskey bottle. Oh, that explains the headache. I reach for the bottle and tossed it into the wastebasket. Whatever I had done last night is completely forgotten now. I grab a rag and polish the barrel until I can see a blurred reflection of myself looking back at me. I count each counterclockwise rotation. It's monotonous, but it calms my nerves. It's all part of my routine. My routine keeps me alive. My routine keeps me sane. I lay my gun to the side and look out the window at the sun as it crawls over the mountain peaks that line the sky like jagged teeth. It's a nice morning, yet I wish I could fully appreciate it. I can't seem to distract myself from my dream. People used to tell me they have a hard time remembering their dreams, but not me. My dreams stay burned into my brain like a brand, replaying themselves whenever I have a moment of peace. It was dark. I was hiding. From what? I don't know. But I knew it was there. I could smell its foul, festering stench. I could hear its heavy, shuffled footsteps. I closed my eyes in the vague hopes that it would somehow shelter me. I could hear the footsteps slide closer and closer until I couldn't hear them any more. Thinking the worst was over, I opened my eyes. In front of me, there was a figure, a woman. Her thin face is shrouded with long, dripping wet hair. I cannot see her eyes, but I know she can see me. Then I woke up. I can't remember the last time I had a pleasant dream. Hell, I don't even think I've ever had a pleasant dream. As a boy, I was plagued by night terrors. I'd wake up in the night screaming. My mother would come running in to calm me down. She'd hold me and tell me to focus on the sound of her voice. She told me to think happy thoughts, and I'd never have one again. It never worked. Happy thoughts don't come easy to me. So the nightmares always stayed. But who's to say that's a bad thing? I've never understood why people insist on having sweet dreams. It sets expectations too high for life. Nightmares keep you grounded. They keep things in perspective. Life can seem to be terrible, but the horrors it holds for you will never quite be as bad as what your subconscious can create while you sleep. Yeah, at least that's what I tell myself. 8:28 a.m. I make myself a quick breakfast, the last of the rabbit. A measly portion like this isn't going to last me until tomorrow. I'll have to catch another if I want dinner tonight. I look down at my watch again and attempt to time out a schedule for the day. If I head out now, I can still have time to chop wood before the sun goes down. Between keeping warm last night and making breakfast, I only left myself half a log and a few twigs for kindling. If there was anything worse than a cold night up in these mountains, it was a cold night in the dark. The mind begins to wander when left alone in the dark. It fills the blackness with anything it can muster. Oftentimes, it shows you the last thing you want to see. I put on my coat, grab my rifle, and make my way towards the door. As it creaks open, it fills the house with the frigid winter air. The chill immediately stabs at my face. I'll definitely have to make this hunting trip quick if I don't want to freeze to death tonight. My old tracks create a path in the snow from my last night's venture into the woods. I follow them, matching my boot into each corresponding footprint. Each step crunches the snow and sends echoes ringing through the silence around me. The forest cages the small clearing that houses my cabin. The towering pines stretch for miles. Beyond them, the mountains climb high into the sky. Beyond them? I don't know. I don't care to know. This vast tundra of frozen ground is my home, my kingdom, my wasteland. I keep away from the outside world, and it keeps away from me. It's an unspoken bond that has served me well these past 3 years. I loathe the world I left behind. Day in and day out, I found myself surrounded by people I could not stand to be around. It was all too much for me. I don't remember exactly when I realized I couldn't take it anymore. But one day, I knew I had to get away while I could, while I still had an ounce of sanity left within me. I severed almost all ties I had to that life. Anyone worth knowing was gone, and I had no interest in meeting anyone new. The only contact I still have is an old friend, Harry, who's a trucker. Once a month, his route takes him to a dirt road about 5 miles away from my cabin. He keeps me supplied with my bare essentials and anything I might need or want. I never ask for much, some canned food, booze, hunting supplies, a few books, and fresh water. I haven't actually seen him since he first brought me up here 2 years ago. He leaves the cargo for me, I fetch it and bring it here. Every now and then he'll leave me a note, but all they do is sit in crumpled balls under my bed. I've never bothered reading one. 12:31 p.m. I look up from my watch at the sun shining through the tree's canopy. I've been on this little shit's trail for 3 hours, endlessly following through his labyrinth of trees. Any time I get a clear shot, the bastard scurries off. I followed him to the edge of a pond within the forest. I sat behind a fallen tree and rested my elbows on its cold, frozen bark, waiting for him to stop moving for a second, so I can get him in my sights. I've been here for a while now, but that's what hunting takes. Patience. A hell of a lot of patience. But I'm used to this. When you live a life like I do, patience is a big part of your day. Maybe tomorrow I'll take a walk down to Harry's Road and leave him a list of parts so I can build a few traps. It would make getting food a lot easier. I could use the spare time to engage myself in other ways. I never did mind hunting, though. There's a certain satisfaction in feasting on a meal you killed yourself. The thought of it makes my stomach rumble with hunger. At last he quits moving. I align his small, furry body with the crosshairs when something in my peripheral catches my eye. Beneath the ice of the frozen pond, I see a blurred shadow slowly moving about. I've tried fishing in that pond enough times to know that there's nothing living in there. So what is that? Can't be a log that's moving around too much. Whatever is under there has to be alive. My eyes dart back to the crosshairs for a second. The rabbit's gone. I let myself get distracted, and now it's run off. I punched the overturned tree, splitting the skin on my knuckles a bit. No, I can't let this work myself up too much. I have a hard time bringing myself down after I work myself up. If I let myself get angry, I'll never be able to focus hard enough to catch the little shit. I head closer to the edge of the pond to where he was standing and look for a trace of tracks to point which direction he went. The shadow under the ice moves again. I can see it more clearly now. It's a large silhouette eerily swaying beneath the ice. I laid down my rifle and inched closer to the bank of the pond. The shape looks almost human. I look across the ice surface. There's no break or crack to be seen. Nothing could have fallen in and still be alive. I put a bit of my weight on the ice. It's solid. It should be able to be stable enough for me to walk on. Step by step, I carefully make my way to the shadow as it carries on its ghoulish dance. I loom over it and can see through the frosted layer between us that it is certainly human. This is impossible. How did they get down there? How are they still alive? I bend down to my knees and wipe away the layer of snow atop the ice. A hand is pressed against the other side. It's a thin, dainty hand, a woman's. Wrapped around her pale finger is a gold wedding band. I press my hand against the ice to match hers. I have to find a way to get her out. I survey the area to see if there's a nearby rock or branch I can use to break the ice. I shift my weight to stand up. In an instant, the ice shatters beneath my feet and sends me plummeting into the sub-zero temperatures below its surface. The water is so cold, it burns my skin with its touch. My entire body momentarily shuts down as I sink further down. As soon as my head is submerged, I'm suddenly jolted back into consciousness. My arms flail desperately, trying to find the edge of the ice to pull myself back up. My thoughts are rapid and incomprehensible. Somehow I'm able to find the edge. I grip it hard and pull my torso onto the ice surface. I put my weight onto my elbows and force myself completely out of the water. The frigid air feels like summer compared to the depths I just crawled from. My body lies limp, staring into the sky as I try to catch my breath. My head is still spinning as if it hasn't caught up to my body yet and is still drowning in those freezing waters. The woman. What happened to her in all that commotion? I turn over and look into the hole. She's gone. Great. This is exactly what I need. No food and a vanishing woman. I stand myself up and carefully shuffle myself back to land. I can immediately feel the difference of solid ground under my feet through my soaking boots. I have to get out of these clothes unless I want to get hypothermia. I almost did when I first moved up here, and it's not an experience I want to live through again. I grab my rifle and begin to follow my footprints back home. That fucking rabbit. I hate it for bringing me here. Tomorrow I'll get that little shit and have the most satisfying meal of my lifetime. As I make my way through the trees, I can't help but think of the woman. I tell myself that my hunger and frustration must have gotten the better of me, made me see things that weren't there. But something about her gave me a strange feeling of déjà vu. That pale, ringed hand seemed so strange yet so familiar. 4:15 p.m. Somehow I make it home. I don't know how, but I did. About halfway there, the cold began to set in, and I contemplated stopping. I just wanted to lay down in the snow and let the cold consume me. But something about dying then and there seemed weak, like I was giving up. I didn't want to go out like that. For a while, death is such a foreign concept to us. It's something we hear about, maybe imagine, but it's all a fantasy. Something that is so far out of reach it could never happen to you. Then suddenly it's there. It comes in like an unwanted visitor that refuses to leave. It buries itself deep under your skin. You can't see it, but you know it's there. For the rest of your life, however short or long that may be, it patiently waits there until it can claim you and attach itself to the next poor soul. I slide my gun back under my bed and lay my soaked clothes next to the furnace. It's still burning the last bit of leftover wood from last night. It's not giving off much heat anymore, but they'll dry in time. I sit by the warm glow and try to get some color back into me. The warmth slowly begins to thaw me. At first, the sharp contrast in temperature hurts my skin, but I welcome it. In the cold, I had become numb to all sensation. It's good to feel again. Once I'm practically dry, I put on a new outfit and head back outside to chop wood. I look up at the sky. I have about an hour or two before I lose the sun. I walk out the door and head to the other side of the cabin. I remove the large nylon tarp from the woodpile and pick up my axe. Although chopping wood is a chore, it's one I sometimes enjoy. When I build up frustration after a bad day, I need an outlet to get it all out, and I've had a hell of a day. The wooden handle feels good in my grip. I hold on tight and bring the sharp metal blade high over my head. With everything I have, I hurl it down into the log at my feet. In one clean motion, the log splits in two. So satisfying. 6:02 p.m. Whiskey warms my entire body in a way only alcohol can do. The sun is gone, but my house is filled with a light orange glow. With the furnace, bright flames lick and crawl over the logs, letting out a hiss as they take over their new victim. The flames feed, growing even stronger as the wood grows weaker. Eventually, the ambush will end. All they will leave behind is a dead black husk of what existed before. The flames will jump and dance at the defeat of their prey. But in their celebration, they will grow ignorant and forget what had been given them their power. They will attempt to maintain themselves on whatever they have left over, but they were greedy and left no spare traces. Their inevitable defeat is brought upon by their own victory. But it is not all for nothing. Amongst his dying brothers, an ember will always hang on to life. He'll be taken away by the wind to a new and strange place. But in his confusion, he'll find new victims to prey upon. Once again, he will grow strong. I take back a swig of whiskey and laugh at the idea of the never-ending cycle. I usually try to save my alcohol for a celebration, when I can properly enjoy it with a good meal. But I've had a long day and no longer give a shit. I fill my mouth with the amber liquid and swallow. It burns like hell going down, but settles nicely in my stomach. It's late. Most of the bottle is empty. I probably should have stopped a while ago, but I didn't care. I deserve to treat myself after what I've been through today. It's safe to say that I'm hammered. I remember when I used to get drunk like this in the city. After a long work week, Saturday nights were usually spent with my face down against a cold bar with an empty glass in my hand and an open tab. The bars were loud and the people were annoying, but I was always able to get drunk enough to drown them out. Somehow I'd make it home and in bed, usually making a mess and trashing the house in the process. The floor beneath my ass grows harder and more uncomfortable. I grab a table ledge and pull myself to my feet. The room moves uncontrollably as I make my way into the kitchen. I punch the wall to tell it to stop, but it doesn't listen. I need to take it easier. I'm going to be sick. I slump over the sink and turn the water on. The cool water pours over my hands and settles me. I splash some on my face and look out the window. Why'd I come here alone? I only ever needed myself, but sometimes I do get a little lonely. The clouds fully engulf the moon, making my cabin the only source of light. I focus into the darkness and am filled with a sense of dread. Something is out there. At first, I think I'm seeing things, but then I see it again, slowly moving toward the cabin. I press my nose against the glass. I tell myself that it's probably just a wolf or deer, but the shape is human. A woman now stands just outside the cabin. Her hair is long and hangs in her face. She's wearing a long white nightgown. She is soaking wet. She is the woman from the ice. She does not move. She just stands there, looking down at her feet. Her eyes are drawn to her left hand. I can't get the image of it pressed against the ice out of my head. That pale, thin hand with the gold wedding band. I look back at her face. She is now looking directly at me. Her gaze pierces through her dripping hair and locks onto me. I've never felt such an uneasy feeling in my life. I'm sick to my stomach now. I flail my arms, gesturing for her to look away or hopefully just leave. But she stays where she is, fixated on me. I can't take this anymore. I turn away from her and run from the kitchen, through my living room, and into my bed. I just need some sleep. Tomorrow, all of this will go away and I can get back into the swing of things. My head is reeling. The room continues to move around me. I look down at my bed, but I can't bring it into the focus. I lean forward and reach for it, but miss and fall to the floor. I fail to brace myself, and my head bumps against the floor. The pain shoots through me as I lay there. I groan and open my eyes. Under the bed lay several of the crumpled-up notes from Harry. The haze of my fall begins to clear, and I make out the words, "Police" and "suspicious" written on one. What the hell? I grab the paper and unfold it. The words spin around the page as I try to read them. I rub my eyes and try to focus. "Hope you're doing okay. The police questioned me and were suspicious for a while. But I think we're in the clear now. You don't have to worry about them finding you up here. Hope these supplies will last you until next month. Keep in touch. Harry." Police? What the hell is this all about? I open up another note. "Was hoping you would have gotten back to me. Are you okay? I'm getting worried about you. After what happened, I hope you're keeping yourself together up there. Harry." My head is going a mile a minute. What is he talking about? After what happened? Why should he be worried? What's going on? I grabbed another and quickly unfolded. Really wish you'd get back to me. I don't know what you're doing with yourself all alone up there. I could give you some company when I come by if you need. I just worry what you might be doing to yourself. I'm sorry to bring this up and be so blunt, but a guy doesn't just drown his wife and walk away like nothing happened. Really, you can talk to me about it. Please let me know how you're doing. Harry. What is he getting at? He has to be fucking with me. I tossed the papers back under the bed. I was never married, and I sure as hell have never killed anyone. I'm not hiding from anyone. I'm here because I want to be. I need the isolation, don't I? I am so confused. I've been through too much tonight. I can't take this right now. I look down at my hands. My fingers are feverishly shaking. I bring myself to my knees. I couldn't kill anyone, could I? I look at my left hand. What is wrong with me? How did I ever notice this? A faded ring of pale white skin wraps the base of my ring finger. I feel like I was beaten over the head. My thoughts scramble and slowly come together. Samantha. I had another day of my boss cheering me out at work. I came home agitated, on edge, and roaring drunk. I just wanted to be left alone to drink. And she knew that, but she yelled. She yelled at me for coming home drunk every other night. We fought. We screamed. We threw things at each other. Eventually, she said she was done with me and went into the bathroom to start a bath to calm herself down. But I wasn't calm. I needed to tell her exactly what I thought about her and her shit. How could she just walk away like that, like nothing happened? Like we never loved each other. Like I wasn't worth her time. Then she started humming. That hum got under my skin. I just couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't take her anymore. I buried my face in my hands. My tears run down my palms and fall to the floor. I can hear footsteps coming in through the living room. It's her. Why can't she just leave me alone? Why can't she just let me be? I just want to be left alone. The fire has begun to die down. The light doesn't reach my room anymore. I sit in the dark on my bedroom floor. I can hear her footsteps getting closer. She begins to hum. I can't take this. I crawl to the corner of the room next to my dresser. Just leave me alone, please. Her footsteps grow closer and closer. My toes curl and my heart races. I shut my eyes. Just go away. Please, go away. You're not real. You're dead. I killed you. I fucking killed you. Just go. Let me live. Let me forget. It's quiet. Is she gone? I open my eyes. She is inches away from my face. I try to scream, but I can't. Her long brown hair hangs over her face, dripping on the floor between us. Her eyes look deep within me. I begin to get lightheaded. My eyes grow weary and I fall to the floor. Everything flies by me except her. She stays in focus, fixated on me. Then everything is black. 6:52 a.m. Another nightmare. I wake up in a pool of my own sweat. My heart is pounding and my head feels like it's going to break through my skull. Through the window, the sun has just begun to rise, banishing the demons and the darkness of the night back to hell. I sit up and pull my rifle out from under the bed, knocking over a newly emptied whiskey bottle. Well, that explains the headache. I reach for the bottle and toss it into the wastebasket. It clinks against the other bottles. Whatever I'd done last night is completely forgotten now. I grab a rag and polish the barrel until I can see a blurred reflection of myself looking back at me. I count each counterclockwise rotation. It's monotonous, but it calms my nerves. It's all part of my routine. My routine keeps me alive. My routine keeps me sane. 'Twas the Night Before Christmas by Clement Clark Moore. Narrated by Otis Jiry. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas would soon be there. The children were all nestled snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And Mamma, in her kerchief, and I in my cap, had just settled down for a long winter's nap, when out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from the bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow give the luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wandering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be Saint Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donner and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all, as dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle mount to the sky. So up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with the sleigh full of toys, and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the dancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my hand and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled! His dimples, how merry! His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard of his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. Not spoke a word, but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him explain, ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night."
Chilling tales for dark nights.